In this final lesson, looking at the issue of delegated legislation, what we're going to do is spend some time talking about the advantages and disadvantages associated with the use of delegated legislation. Now, the advantages are some things that we've already focused on in the previous video. We looked at the reason for why you would have delegated legislation. So we're not going to touch on the advantages in too much detail in this video. If you want to see more on the advantages of delegated legislation, go back to looking at the previous lesson. But we're going to spend a little bit of time also thinking about the disadvantages, why delegated legislation can be critiqued in various different circumstances. And so really, let's just begin very quickly and think about the advantages. We know already that the use of delegated legislation can be particularly important for its efficiency and speed. So delegated legislation allows for the swift implementation of legal provisions. Parliament does not have to spend time debating the very fine details of every single law, which allows the government then to act very quickly in areas that require detailed rules or immediate action. And so an example of this, of course, is in emergency situations. We illustrated the example of the previous lesson on the use of emergency powers during the COVID-19 pandemic. The government can use delegated powers in those circumstances to very quickly pass regulations without having to wait for full parliamentary approval or full parliamentary debates, and this ensures a timely and effective use of actions that are taken. Delegated legislation is also flexible and very adaptable. It provides the ability to adapt laws to changing circumstances. Regulatory bodies or ministers are able to then adjust or to very quickly update regulations when they are very quickly needed to be updated. This is without the need for a lengthy legislative process. This is particularly important in fields that evolve rapidly, so technology, finance, healthcare, for example, and an illustration that you could use is financial markets or data protection regulations. The use of cryptocurrencies or NFTs as well. These are two new areas of financial regulation that have evolved very quickly over the last few years. And so the use of delegated legislation could be important to be able to rapidly react to these kinds of changing sectors. Regulations can be updated to reflect new practices, new innovations, or even new challenges without having to amend the primary legislation every single time. Delegated legislation also has the advantage of requiring specialized knowledge, and ministers or regulatory bodies may have more expertise than those who are just general MPs, general members of parliament. So delegating legislative powers to experts ensures that laws are implemented based on these technical industry-specific areas of knowledge. So an example that you could maybe illustrate is in the field of environmental regulation. Agencies like the Environment Agency have the necessary expertise to look at issues surrounding things relating to waste management, pollution control, or climate change, and they are able to adapt very quickly with detailed and specialized delegated legislation, which is something that would be very difficult for Parliament to deal with and handle directly. Delegated legislation is also very, very cost effective. The process of passing a primary legislation, the process of passing an act of parliament, can be time consuming and costly. And so by delegating certain legislative functions, governments can reduce the administrative burdens and to avoid unnecessary expenditure of time and resources in the legislative process. Local councils might use delegated powers to pass bylaws, related to things like public amenities or local services. Again, all of this saving the national parliament from having to delegate on each of these issues individually. It also has the advantage of handling technical and routine matters, so things like setting specific fees, defining administrative procedures, establishing quotas or regulated activities. All of these things can be done through delegated legislation and allows for these types of rules to be created without needing to clutter the parliamentary agenda with minor technicalities. So, for example, and this is an example that I also used in the previous lesson, Parliament might delegate to a minister the authority to set health and safety standards in particular factories. These are things that can be adjusted regularly and reflect the technological advancements and best practices at the time, without the necessary requirement of needing Parliament to engage within that particular area. Delegated legislation also allows laws to be tailored to specific regions, to specific industries, or to specific issues. So, for example, a local government can create a bylaw concerning parking regulations or littering within their specific jurisdiction. This can be done without having to wait for a national legislature, such as Parliament, to pass laws that cover all of these very small-scale, location-specific issues. And then finally, an advantage that we didn't touch on in the previous lesson is its ability to enable compliance with international standards. So delegated legislation allows the government to quickly adopt and implement international agreements, international conventions, and international obligations. So for example, international agreements on climate change or trade could be used and could be adhered to through the use of delegated legislation. So, for example, when thinking about setting tariff schedules in international trade regulation, this is something that is not done and debated in Parliament. Parliament doesn't debate on the exact schedule for every single item that is traded. Basically, a tariff schedule, if you Google a tariff schedule, you can find them for every country, is a huge list of every single thing that is traded, that is imported and exported, and it is the tariff rate that is set on each of those items. It's a huge 800-page document that is very detailed, very, very, very boring, and it is not debated about whether or not technical regulations and tariff schedules on beef products are going to be set at whichever percent. That is not debated in Parliament. That is something that is left to lawyers, presumably, to regulate themselves. So with there being advantages, there are obviously also disadvantages associated with delegated legislation. The first of these is that you could argue that there is a lack of democratic scrutiny. One of the main criticisms is that it bypasses the full democratic scrutiny that parliamentary legislation goes through when it goes into the parliamentary process. Delegated legislation is often made without that same level of public debate, which means that there is less transparency in how these laws are created. So, for example, statutory instruments are frequently scrutinised by parliamentary committees rather than by full debates in the House of Commons. Now, while there is members of parliament that sit on these parliamentary committees, and these are obviously elected by the people, it's not the same necessarily as full debates in the House of Commons. There is also the risk of abuse of power when governments are given delegated legislation and delegated powers, particularly if the enabling act in question is particularly vague or broad when we think about its wording. A government minister may therefore take advantage of delegated powers in order to enact laws that are not intended by Parliament, or that maybe even just exceed the scope of what was meant to be delegated. So this could lead to an undermining of constitutional rights or even public freedoms. Similar to the first point, delegated legislation is often made by government ministers or regulatory bodies, which may not be directly accountable to Parliament for the specific content of these regulations. And so while Parliament does provide oversight and control over these different pieces of delegated legislation, and while ministers are responsible to Parliament to do this, delegated legislation can sometimes lead to a disconnection between public responsibility, political responsibility, and the detailed rules that are actually enacted. For example, a minister who makes controversial regulatory decisions may not face the same level of scrutiny or accountability as they would have done if that decision had been made by a thorough parliamentary process. There is also the potential for complexity and ambiguity. So while delegated legislation can be highly technical, it could also become excessively complex and difficult to understand, especially for those whom it directly affects. The detailed nature of delegated legislation might make it harder for the public or even practitioners to interpret or even to comply with these rules. One such example could be in regards to health and safety regulations for workplaces. They can become so detailed and numerous that employers and employees have difficulty understanding what is actually required of them. And so non-compliance can be more rather due to confusion than that of negligence. Furthermore, while delegated legislation is useful for addressing local needs, it can also lead to inconsistencies between the different regions and sectors if there is a lack of national coordination on these issues. So, for example, if a local authority were to create different parking regulations or noise ordinances, people who move between these regions might struggle to navigate the varying different rules, leading to inconsistency. Another example is, of course, something that we've spoken about, I'm not going to spend too much time thinking of, is that the risk of unconstitutional legislation, the risk of going ultra vires, going beyond one's powers, and causing this delegated legislation to become invalidated. And then penultimately, we see that even though some forms of delegated legislation are indeed subjected to and are controlled by parliamentary committees, the scrutiny process can sometimes be limited or indirect. Parliament may lack, for example, the time or the expertise to review every single piece of delegated legislation thoroughly. And it goes to show that if one of the advantages is that it allows for people to pass legislation without the delegation of control or without having to know all of the very detailed and minute intricate complexities of a particular issue, then that limits the amount of scrutiny that is available, because if the members of parliament that are tasked with scrutinizing that particular piece of delegated legislation have to have the expertise necessary to understand it, and they don't because that's the purpose of the legislation in the first place, then you could argue that this represents something of a disconnect between the ability for Parliament to regulate and the ability to hold them accountable. And then finally, you have this idea that it could sometimes lead to potential fragmentation of the legal system. With the widespread use of delegated legislation, this risk leads to a system where the law becomes fragmented, with different authorities issuing different laws on different subjects. Now, this isn't necessarily too difficult to reconcile, but it can sometimes cause a lack of coherence in the legal system. So different agencies or local authorities might issue regulations related to the same issue, such as environmental protection, but they might do so using different rules, leading often to conflicting and overlapping circumstances. So overall, there are advantages associated with delegated legislation. I would probably, if you were to get an essay that asks you to examine whether or not the legislation is delegated legislation is good or bad, overall you would probably argue that it is a good thing. You can't really have a system without it, but there are definitely things that you can raise as issues and critiques of the use of delegated legislation that can sometimes lead to systems that are not as effective or as efficient as they perhaps should be. And so you can write a good essay on that particular issue. The next lessons are going to start thinking about the rules relating to statutory interpretation, the literal rule, the golden rule, the mischief rule, and the purposive approach to statutory interpretation.